Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Emily Vinci, the librarian and chair of the HWA Library Advisory Council, and I'm very excited to be here moderating the Summer Scares YA panel. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some technical details. Links to Summer Scares resources and information were included in the reminder email you received from Zoom 1 hour ago. To download them, please open that email, scroll to the bottom, and click on the link located there. You can also ask for these links in the Q&A. If you have any trouble, please contact us at webinars@booklistonline.com. The audience is in listen-only mode, but we welcome any questions you may have. On the bottom of your screen is a toolbar with a section for Q&A. If you have a question or need technical assistance, simply click Q&A and type your message in the box that appears. We will do our best to respond to all tech-related questions, and we'll pass along all other questions to today's panelists so they can follow up with you later after the webinar. Booklist offers closed captioning on all webinars. To enable or disable captions on your screen, please look for and click the live transcript icon on the toolbar mentioned earlier. From there, you can select show or hide captions from the menu that appears. If you choose to enable captions, you can adjust the size of them at any time by selecting caption settings. And finally, Booklist expects all participants to maintain an atmosphere of respect and fairness. Anyone who violates the standard of behavior, including engaging in any form of harassment, may, at the discretion of the organizers, be immediately removed. All right, so with that, we'd like to start today's program with a brief introduction about the Summer Scares program. For those of you who are unfamiliar, this is the 5th year of Summer Scares, 5th year that we've released a Summer Scares reading list, which includes titles selected by a panel of authors and librarians, and is designed to promote horror as a great reading option for all ages and during all times of the year. This program is designed by the Horror Writers Association, HWA, in partnership with United for Libraries, Book Riot, and Booklist. As I mentioned earlier, we sent a link to the 2023 Summer Scares programming guide, but please feel free to ask for that in the Q&A box if you are unable to locate it. We'd be happy to share it with you. All right, so with all of that housekeeping out of the way, let's get to the panel. We have some fantastic folks with us today to talk about some fantastic titles. I'm very excited to get into it. So we will be hearing from Kat Winters, author of In the Shadows of Blackbirds from Amulet Books, Maggie Tokuda-Hall and Lisa Sterle, creators of Squad from Green Willow Books, and Suzanne Walker, author of Mooncakes from Oni Press. We will hear a brief introduction from each author about their book and then move to the Q&A portion of the webinar. Okay, we will start with Kat Winters, author of In the Shadows of Blackbirds. Hi, Kat.
Hello there. Thank you so much for the introduction, Emily. Really excited to be here. So I am Kat Winters, and I am the author, as Emily said, of In the Shadow of Blackbirds, as well as some other YA novels that all pretty much fall under the horror category. And I typically write, I've always written historical horror. So you're getting some history along with your scares in my books. This particular novel, this is actually my debut YA novel, and I'm very, very happy that it's been included in Summer Scares and getting some more life out of it. This one is about a 16-year-old girl who, it takes place in the year 1918. She is facing the impact that World War I has on the United States. She is facing a pandemic, the 1918 flu pandemic, and all the various ways that that pandemic affected the United States. She is encountering more and more people who are turning to seances and spirit photography to find solace for their grief from losing so many people through either or World War I and the 1918 flu. and she herself encounters a ghost of somebody she loves. So this is the very surreal thing for me about this book is I wrote it in an era before our current pandemic. It released before our pandemic. I used to give talks explaining to people what it was like to live during a pandemic. I went to school visits and had kids put masks on their face to show how people prevented getting the flu back then. It is just still to this day very weird to me that that we're now living in a setting that matches my horror story. And one thing I wanted to do when I was writing this book, I wanted to make it a literary time machine was my goal. So I included a lot of historical photographs, including archival spirit photography. These are spirit photography started in, I believe it was around the 1860s, after the Civil War. It first became popular, but it was popular after World War I as well. People would go to photographers, pose for a studio portrait, and in the finished photograph, you might see the spirit of your loved one hovering behind you. This was an era before Photoshop, but photographers knew how to do trick photography from the get-go. So they did all sorts of hoaxes and basically were scamming people out of money in a really cruel way. Some of them did get caught and went to jail. So I've got pictures of seances from the time period. I've got some imagery from the 1918 flu and World War I, trying to get people to help in both efforts. And here's a photograph of people wearing masks in 1918. So that's that book in a nutshell, and I look forward to talking more about it throughout this panel.
Thank you so much, Kat. All right, now we will hear from Maggie Tokuda-Hall and Lisa Sterle from Squad. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. I feel like I can speak confidently for both of us, and I say we're really jazzed to have been included in the Summer Scares program. It's pretty cool. So I'm Maggie. I'm the author of Squad. It is set in the town where I grew up, which is called Piedmont, which is sort of like a wealthy suburb in the Bay Area. And it's about Becca, who has transferred from another high school and just desperately wants to fit in because she's never really fit in anywhere before. And so when she gets kind of wrapped up immediately with this group of ultra popular girls, she is super excited, even when she finds out that there's a catch, which is that every month at the full moon, they turn into werewolves, find the worst boy they can at a party and eat him. And, you know, it's got blood and boobs and all the good stuff. So, Lisa, what do you have to say?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Sterle. I'm the artist of Squad. So yeah, I'm responsible for all of the art in this graphic novel. I came onto this book after Maggie had written the first draft. I think it was almost pretty much done though, and our editor Martha approached me and asked if I wanted to illustrate a comic book about teen girls turning into werewolves, and I could not say no. I've always been a huge fan of horror, and I think this was my first YA official project, so it was great first one to start with. Maggie's story was so inspiring, and I love to draw both horror and like teens and fashion and girl squads and ovens, and so yeah, this project, this comic combines everything that I love. Yeah.
It's worth saying Lisa was our absolute top choice for an illustrator. We did not have a backup option. At least that we had not gotten far enough into that conversation to have a backup option. And one of my favorite things about writing Squad that Lisa made so much bigger and brighter on the page was sort of the juxtaposition of, you know, like pretty teen girls, bubblegum, like glitter, sparkles, all the like fun high femme things, and just like the absolute grotesquerie of these girls transforming and violently devouring their prey. And so if you are a fan of sort of the line of horror comedy, or you're looking for one that particularly addresses rape culture, we hope you enjoy Squad.
That sums it up perfectly.
Thank you both so much. All right, so now we will move on to Suzanne to talk to us about mooncakes. Take it away, Suzanne.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Suzanne Walker, and I am one of the two co-creators of Mooncakes, along with my co-creator and artist, Wendy Shu, who could unfortunately not be here today. We originally started Mooncakes almost 8 years ago as a actually almost exactly 8 years ago as a webcomic that was a project between the two of us. Wendy had an idea of a witch and a werewolf who had fallen in love. It just sort of spiraled from there. It was always originally a romance between Nova, who is a witch in training, and Tam, who is a non-binary werewolf. They are friends in childhood who are separated, and then they are reunited many years later, and they fall in love. And it's sort of a monster of the week with the monster of the week sort of plot line is the backdrop, so they contend with demons and ghosts and magic of all kinds while they are sort of finding out about each other and who they are as people, or witches and or werewolves. Yeah, this story was truly a product of collaboration and friendship between Wendy and me. We started it first when I was living in New York, and we were both living in New York, and I was about to move to Chicago, and we wanted a way to keep in touch with each other. So we started working on this comic together as a way to just sort of like ensure that we were going to continually be in contact, because I was writing the script and she was drawing the panels for it. And eventually, after the first few chapters were posted as a webcomic, we were contacted by some publishers who wanted to see if we were interested in turning it into a graphic novel. And it was published as a graphic novel in 2019. And really the heart of it has always been just about finding the ordinary in the supernatural, which I think has always been sort of an important thing for me, is like that magic is something that's extraordinary and something that enhances everything around it, but also is just a regular everyday occurrence in the lives of these characters. And that doesn't make it any less extraordinary, but it's just a part of their lives. Working with Wendy is always I think sort of what Maggie and Lisa are talking about, a great juxtaposition between the very sort of fae and adorable forest spirits that we have in the story, juxtaposed with the horrifying eldritch horse demons that also are employed by the villains in the book. And really, it's a story about queerness and belonging and teenagers trying to find their way in the midst of horse demons and sort of neighborhood watch demon rituals and stuff like that. So that is Mooncakes in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. And I hope everybody watching has added 3 new titles to their TBR, unless you've already read these books. But if you haven't, hearty recommendation to check them out. So now that we have met all of the creators that are here with us today, I'd like to talk to them a little bit more about their process and their relationship to the horror genre. So if you want to turn on your cameras, you're welcome to, because I'm going to have some questions to throw out at all of you, and you can all just kind of pick and choose how you want to answer and when you want to answer. So we've heard a little bit about this, but I would like to kind of start with the basics. How you each got into writing, just in general. We'll talk about horror specifically after that, but just how you approached your craft and tackling it and getting into it. So whoever wants to start first, unless you want me to choose. Okay, go, Lisa.
Yeah.
Raise your hand.
Yeah, so I kind of got to comics a little bit later. I went to art school. I thought I was going to be a studio artist. I did large scale figurative oil paintings, and kind of realized after a little bit of time that I didn't enjoy painting anymore. And my now husband and I had an idea for a horror story. And we had actually been talking about a lot of horror movies that we had been watching, and had been a little disappointed by. And so we thought, okay, well, what better way to solve what we're not seeing in horror than to throw our own hat into the ring. And so the first comic I ever made was actually a horror comic, Long Lost. The writer's Matthew Ehrman. And yeah, that story got picked up by a small publisher called Scout Comics, and ever since then I have managed to continue making comics and graphic novels and doing stories that are both horror and not. And I love every minute of it. So yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lisa. Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
I guess I'll go.
Okay. I will start choosing.
I started writing during childhood. I had a teacher who I had for second and third grade who had us write stories every week. And she started making my stories feel like they were something special. She showed them to other teachers. I believe that might have been a ghost story, but I don't remember correctly. But so writing was something that I've always done. I was really into poetry as a child. I had a book of poetry. I started attempting to write novels around the age of 9, but didn't finish them. I would start them, get excited about it, write it down in notebooks. But all along, I thought I wanted to be an actress. Theater was my thing back then. And I went to college and was a drama major. Then I added an English as a second major, started thinking, I really do like literature. Literature has always been my passion. And then I didn't know what to do after college and panicked and went into a student teaching program, got my teaching credential, teaching English. And it was, I think during that experience that I realized I really want to be a writer. Everyone keeps telling me you should be a writer. And I keep saying, no, I want to go into acting. Now I'm going to try teaching. But I realized that's what I wanted to really start taking seriously. But the thing about being a writer is you can't just say, okay, I'm going to be a published novelist now. Here's my application. Can you hire me? It took me until the age of 40 before I got my first book contract after graduating from college at 22, thinking this is the career for me. So I do always like to tell aspiring writers, even overnight success stories often take decades to get there. So if you're on a journey right now and it's seeming like it's taking forever, a lot of us have been on very, very long journeys to get our foot in the door.
Thank you, Kat. That is so important to remember for aspiring writers and artists too. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Right.
All right, Suzanne, how about you? Oh, you're muted.
I'm so sorry. You'd think that after 3 years of doing this, I would remember these things by now. But sort of similar to Kat, I've always been a creative person who's like thinking of stories in my head, but somewhere very early on, I got it in my head that I couldn't be a writer because either I had too many other mental illnesses going on that prevented me from writing, or I heard so many times as a kid about how difficult it was to become a published author that it just never occurred to me. And enough people told me that, oh, I was good at nonfiction writing, but not as good at fiction writing, and that I should pursue nonfiction writing. So I focused a lot on journalism and thought about maybe going to get my PhD. And then after college, it wasn't until after I graduated college that I really started writing fiction, because I suddenly didn't have to go to school and I had all of this spare time that wasn't spent at school. And I was like, well, what am I doing with myself in that spare time? And I just started writing stories. And I started actually pretty early on writing comic scripts around that time, about 10 years ago, I'd say, because I was reading a lot of comics. In college, I had befriended the graphic novels librarian at my university, and I was friends with comic artists. Wendy and I became friends about 10 years ago now, and we started working together on doing scripts and art together very, again, soon after that. And I sort of was developing my comic script work and my prose writing sort of along parallel to each other. And yeah, it's just sort of gone from there. I didn't start thinking about writing as a career to pursue until around my mid-20s, when I realized, because I was still sort of considering getting my PhD. And then I was like, well, for 3 years in a row, I was like, I can't go to grad school, because if I go to grad school, I won't have time to write. And once I thought that for the 3rd year in a row, I was like, oh, maybe I should start pursuing this as an actual thing. So, and then a couple of years after that, we got approached by Oni, well, originally by Lion Forge, about mooncakes, and I started selling a couple of short stories, and it's sort of just gone on from there. But again, as Kat said, it's a very like up and down journey, and you will always be a writer no matter what your status as a published author is, and that's just an important thing to remember, because your fortunes as a published author will ebb and flow, but writing is just always going to be there.
Thank you for sharing. We're getting some solid knowledge, solid wisdom in this webinar is what I'm trying to say. Okay, Maggie, you're next.
Don't worry, that's where this comes to a screeching halt. I always loved stories. I come from a family of storytellers, like really talented storytellers. And so when I was a kid, I actually really struggled with reading. Like I didn't love it a lot. I was really intimidated by sort of like large blocks of text. And so I read Goosebumps books and Calvin and Hobbes, Archie comics almost exclusively. Like that was kind of it from like 2nd through 5th grade. And so when I got into high school and everything, like, and was starting to pursue like AP classes and things like that, I was really going down the art path. I was pretty good at drawing, and I thought that was what I was the best at. And then in the summer between my junior and senior years of high school, I got accepted to the California State Summer School for the Arts, but for writing, which I had applied to kind of on a whim as encouraged by my creative writing teacher at the time. And I went and I like absolutely loved it. But when I went to college, I still was like, I'm going to be a visual artist though. And that's where I really learned that my writing skills outpaced my visual art skills in like a very profound way. Because I could always talk about my art and make it sound interesting, but actually looking at it was not a fulfilling experience. Whereas I could create the kinds of narratives that I wanted to with my words a lot more effectively. And again, I had a creative writing professor who encouraged me to apply to a summer program that was hosted at Skidmore in upstate New York. And it was like 9 to 5 every day. You just talked about writing, workshopped each other's work. And I was never tired. Like at the end of every day, I was just like electric. So I was so into it. And I love getting to talk about stories. And that's when I really like made the decision like, oh, I love writing. But even then I was like, but I'm not good enough to do that professionally. So I need to figure out like what my job is going to be. And so I became a children's bookseller for a really long time. And I had like numerous side hustles. I really wanted to be a children's book editor because I, again, did not think that I could hack it in writing. And then hilariously, I could not hack it as an editor. Like I just couldn't get a job. But eventually I finally finished the manuscript for my first young adult novel, The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea, while I was traveling through South America with my husband. I had like quit my job at Apple. At the time I was working for iBooks. So I was negotiating placement with all like the big publishers in that store. And I quit a very fun and very cushy job to go live in a car with my husband. And we drove down the west coast of South America for like a year and a half. And that was when I finally finished the first draft of The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea, because I had been rewriting the beginning for like 6 years. So the first like 20,000 words of it were these like beautifully polished stones, this like staircase that like went to nowhere. And finally I had the time and the inclination and frankly, my husband nagging me and just being like, just do it every day for me to finish it. And when I came home from that trip was when I signed my 2-book deal with Candlewick. And from then on, I've been doing this as my full-time job.
Fantastic. Thank you all for sharing. So we have a question from the audience, which is actually a perfect segue into talking more about horror. So, and this question is actually for Maggie and Lisa. This person is wondering if you have any favorite werewolf books or movies.
I mean, for books, I love Artie and the Wolf Moon by Olivia Stevens, which actually came out the same week as Squad. And it was such a like cool week because it was like, I'm sorry, but you have 2 options for sapphic werewolves this week. Don't worry, we're not limiting you. Like so niche, and yet they're totally different books. And I thought that was so exciting and cool. Lisa, I know you probably got one.
I mean, for movies, An American Werewolf in London is one of my all-time faves, and I think there's very few movies or comics that have topped that werewolf transformation scene, which is on the subject of werewolves, I think one of the hardest parts of drawing a werewolf is transformation and figuring out how you're going to do it and how much you're going to show and what you're going to show. It's definitely tricky.
I love hearing you say that because I outsourced the difficulty to you. Because when I was first writing Squad and I tried to write it as prose, it like didn't work. And part of it was like, how many times are you going to write? How many different descriptive words are there possibly for like rending, ripping, transforming flesh? And I was like, this seems like an illustrator's problem. But Squad, I'd say like is inspired by other werewolf media, which tends to focus on male characters, as it is on like Jennifer's body. Like Jennifer's body to me is Squad's mom. Squad would not exist without Jennifer's body. And so if you liked Squad and you haven't seen Jennifer's body, you can sign up for a service on Twitter where I will yell at you every 10 minutes until you watch it. And it's free.
I'll be back on Twitter just to do that.
Yeah.
Okay, so now I want to open it up. Unless Suzanne and Kat, you also have favorite werewolf books or movies. Feel free to share.
I do, unfortunately, but unfortunately it is by what I like to call the bad wizard author who but unfortunately, for better or worse, Remus Lupin was an extremely formative werewolf to me as a child. But I also I talk a lot about how Mooncakes engages with Harry Potter in a way that I took the things that I thought were ridiculous and didn't make sense and tried to address them in Mooncakes, in terms of just the things that I found just nonsensical, or like, why would they do that? And with werewolves, it was kind of the same thing. I wanted to with Tam as a werewolf, I wanted to examine things that were not necessarily thought of before. Like there's a whole subplot about werewolf magic specifically and what makes the magic that transforms Tam into a werewolf, and sort of the energy can neither be created nor destroyed, and if there's all this energy that is transforming Tam into a werewolf, how can that be harnessed? And that sort of the horror of that and how that can be manipulated is something that I didn't necessarily get from werewolf stories as a child. It was sort of like I'm watching all of these werewolf stories. I definitely also was a Teen Wolf person in the early 2010s, and it was like, what is it that I feel like is lacking from werewolf stories that I have seen? As an interesting side note, I wrote this entire graphic novel about werewolves, but I did not watch An American Werewolf in London until last year. And I watched it and I was like, oh dang, I should have watched this years ago.
That's how I feel about Ginger Snaps, which I still haven't seen. It is apparently like incredible, but it's got some thematic overlap with Squad, and so I like purposefully didn't engage with it. And now I just feel stupid that I haven't watched it yet.
Don't feel stupid. Though I did think of Ginger Snaps while reading Squad, if it means anything. So you probably should watch it. Now.
Parallel invention, yeah.
There we go. Kat, did you have anything that you wanted to add to our werewolf?
Well, I'm more of a ghost story fan, but on the I'll stick to the subject of werewolves. So I do want to recommend Charm and Strange by Stephanie, and I can't remember how to pronounce her last name, so I'm going to spell it Kuehn. Stephanie and I debuted the same year together. We were both nominated for the Morris Award together.
It's
and she
Kuehn.
Thank
Sorry.
you. I heard it in person, but I was just looking up on her website. Wait, did she have a pronunciation? Stephanie's really nice, really smart. And her book was the winner of the Morris Award that year, and it is excellent. It's a family drama involving werewolves. So if you're looking for something a little bit darker, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a fun werewolf novel, but it is really well written, very moving. Charm and Strange.
Thank you for the recommendation. So I also wanted to ask about each of your initial experiences with horror. It doesn't have to, I'm not talking writing horror specifically, but just like maybe the movie that you first saw when you were a kid that scared you and then maybe set you on a path of horror. And if you are currently a horror fan, I know Lisa already mentioned that she is, but feel free to reiterate that. So yeah, what is your experience with horror just as a reader, as a viewer? Just what is it now and what has it been and where did it start?
I'll just go ahead and start.
Go for it.
I think so. Pretty sure the first horror movie I ever saw was a double feature at a sleepover, Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer. And I became obsessed with slashers. I was definitely not old enough to see those movies. I don't remember what age I was, but that is an element of horror, is just a little bit of the forbidden, I suppose. And you know, when you're a teen or a preteen, you're just like anything that you're not supposed to really be indulging in, you're just like, give me more. So that's kind of where it started, was just like I loved slashers in high school, and then kind of dropped off and didn't pick horror back up again until playing Silent Hill 2 in college, and horror video games actually reinvigorated my love of the genre, like Silent Hill 2, Fatal Frame, Resident Evil, and then from there I started getting back into horror films and discovering, you know, all kinds, like decades and decades of films. Suspiria is my favorite. I'm a big fan of Italian giallo horror. And obviously horror graphic novels and comics as well. I've discovered Junji Ito at some point in like my mid-20s, and then I was like, oh cool, I can do this in comics too. And that's kind of, I think, where I started a little path towards like, oh, I can make a horror comic book, because I already love everything else about, film and whatnot. And yeah, and to this day, like, I read a bunch of horror comics. I actually have a weekly movie night with friends where we watch horror movies of varying quality. I honestly say we probably watch more bad movies than good ones, but it's fun. There's always like bad horror movies, campy horror movies, schlocky horror movies also have a very special place in my heart, as well as the classics. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of all types.
Fantastic. Horror is kind of like pizza, right? Like even when it's not good, it's still pizza.
Oh yeah, it's still so fun, even when it's bad. You can always find. I used to be a bit more of a snob. If a horror movie didn't end the way that I thought it should have ended, I would like walk out of the theater and be like, "Oh, they ruined the ending. They should have done this, 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 and this." But nowadays, I'm just like, I can find something to appreciate, whether it's the special effects or the cinematography or the way characters are written or whatever it is. You can always find something that's kind of good. That's you want to take home with you. So yeah, love it.
Thank you, Lisa. Anybody want to go next?
I'll go next because the pizza thing made me think of bagel bites. And I was like, horror is like pizza, especially when it's bad. There's like a certain kind of bad that you crave, which like
pizza
I don't
bagel.
know, like pizza bagel bites where you're like, I recognize that this isn't good. I just like it. Like my favorite movie of all time is Deep Blue Sea, which is a terrible, objectively bad movie. And they clearly thought that they were making Jurassic Park. Like they were taking it very seriously as an undertaking. There's none of the kind of like wink, wink, nudge, nudge that some horror has where they're like, we are aware we're being goofy. Like they, bless them, were like, this will be the next great science fiction horror film franchise of all time. I love it so much that I have created a drinking game around it. That I used to play every year on my birthday with friends, with rules that were like honed over the years. They still don't make any sense because they're always made while drunk, but then they make sense while you're playing, so it works out great. And I, like I said, like I loved Goosebumps growing up. Like I almost read, when I read prose, I only wanted to read spooky, scary stuff. And Kat, I'm with you. Ghosts are my favorite place for horror. I love not knowing if things are a psychological drama or if it's genuinely paranormal. And to that effect, like The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters is one of my absolute favorite novels. It is so spooky and you just like, oof, the whole time not being sure is such a good feeling. And I love horror graphic novels as well. Maud by Jude Doyle came out last year and was probably my favorite of last year's crop. It's kind of like Grown Up Squad in a lot of ways. Like if you were dealing with a lot of the same themes, but took it to a much more adult place, then that would be it. And then currently right now we are living in the age of Yellow Jackets. So I am thrilled once again to be like, I feel like we're in bonanza times for very like, cis female point of view in horror that is like, that's really what I crave the most. I've realized that I am, for the most part, deeply uninterested in a lot of horror that comes from like a cis male, white, heterosexual perspective, because I've seen so much of it throughout my life. And I am so hungry and like greedy for any that comes from any other perspective. And I find that it tends to be a lot scarier. It tends to speak to something a lot deeper in me than like, ooh, did you know that women get old and it's scary? Which is like often the root of male gaze horror. So yeah, it's a fun time to be into horror.
Awesome. Thank you, Maggie. Suzanne, I think you were getting ready to go. So you're up.
Yeah. So I was a huge weenie as a child. I had a lot of anxiety. I got scared very easily. But I liked the idea of horror and I liked the idea of ghost stories, especially. So I pursued a lot of like, I don't want to say horror light, but like I was really into the Addams Family and I loved Scooby-Doo. I loved Scooby-Doo so much. I was very into mysteries that I knew wouldn't scare me, but like I avoided Goosebumps because I was like, oh, that sounds scary. I don't want to see it. But I also read a lot of like one-off ghost story novels whose names I now can't remember, but there were quite a few of them. And I have always been drawn to sort of again, to name Scooby-Doo as a formative presence of mine, the sort of horror comedy. The very first piece of fiction that I wrote as a teenager was a murder mystery that featured a ghost, but also featured a werewolf and a robot who were definitely subtextually gay, living together in a basement. And they were squatting and they were about to get evicted. And the whole B plot was about them fighting to prevent the eviction. And it was just very wacky, like, again, horror comedy kind of thing. And so I've always loved ghosts, and I've always loved the sort of macabre stuff. But then when I was a teenager, I watched a couple of horror movies and I was just bored. Like, I saw Poltergeist and I was very bored. And I watched Psycho and I was like, huh? So I just for a long time assumed that horror was just not something for me. Either it was going to scare me too much, or I was just going to not get whatever it is. And it wasn't until I met my partner, who's my partner loves horror, and my partner is a huge horror fan, and they have been slowly introducing me to the horror staples over the years. And I think, sort of speaking to what Maggie was talking about, I think a lot of the reason a lot of horror doesn't resonate with me is because so much of it is the cis male gaze and the cis male idea of what is scary. And I'm just kind of like, okay, sure. I'm not like, this isn't scary to me. Like, and I think that's also kind of why I would get drawn more to slasher films than like spookier horror films, because gore at least is interesting to me in a, that sounds awful to say, but like gore is interesting to me. Body horror is much more interesting to me. And now that I'm discovering the kinds of horror that do not cater to that gaze, I'm like, oh, there's a lot of interesting things to go into here. There's a lot of things that I can discover that are truly terrifying in some ways, or that are just such complete eldritch body horror that I love for reasons that I can't explain. Like, I don't know if anybody here watches the TV show The Owl House, but my favorite part of The Owl House is this horrible owl bird demon tube named Hootie. And every piece of horror featuring Hootie is just like awful body horror guts that everybody else I know who watches the show finds terrifying and upsetting. And I'm just like, this is the best thing in the world. I love this. I love Hootie. So that's sort of my horror journey.
Thank you for sharing, Suzanne. Kat, how about you?
Well, like I said, ghosts were my gateway into horror. I think it all started my elementary school was really into Halloween when I was a kid, like really into it. We had a major Halloween carnival, like the weekend before Halloween. There was the sixth graders would put a haunted house on the school stage. That was really, I was too scared to go into it until I was older. We had costume parades. Leading up to Halloween, my teachers would read spooky stories and play spooky songs. And it was just, I just loved it. I could sort of the feel and the smells of that season growing up. And it just was it was like right after the school year started. So it's just a fun way to start the school year for me. I don't know if everyone was really thrilled about it, but I loved it. And then one of my first collections of ghost stories is this book that I still have. This is my original copy. I know it's backwards. It's called 13 Ghostly Tales. And it is just a collection of kind of their popular ghost tales just collected in one book. So this is my old copy from the 70s. Loved that. As far as movies go, if my sister is watching this, which she said she might be, please cover your ears, Carrie. My favorite movie when I was 10 years old was called Watcher in the Woods. There's been a remake of it. It's a Disney film. It had Betty Davis in it, about this spooky, ghostly girl who was watching a family who had moved into a English manor, and trying to figure out what that was all about. My sister hated it. And again, if she's watching this, I apologize for bringing it up. But I loved that. There was Something Wicked This Way Comes was a movie when I was a kid. I remember, I can't remember if it was on TV or I just kept renting the video every Halloween season based on a Ray Bradbury story. And then when I was a teenager, I really got into, well, I actually did get into Hitchcock from pretty early age. I was a big Vertigo fan because Vertigo kind of had a sort of a ghostly feel to it because a woman was potentially possessed by the ghost of a dead woman. But I really also got into vampires as a teenager. That's when Lost Boys was new. I was a teenager in the 80s, loved Dracula. I dressed up as a vampire every other year for Halloween. I was Dracula's bride. I had my go-to costume and I loved it. I loved it so much. And actually my very first novel that I sold, well, I didn't sell, but the first novel that allowed me to sign with my literary agent way back in 2007 was a novel about a vampire trying to fit into the suburbs. It was a suburban satire, so it was totally different than my novels that have been published. That one never did find a publishing home, but it did lead me to my my agent. And of course, I love like more modern. Well, they're old. They're getting old now, but like movies like The Others, Sixth Sense. And Maggie, I'm so excited that you brought up The Little Stranger because I love that. That's one of my favorite ghost stories. Sterle Waters' books are amazing. I also loved Affinity, which involves spiritualism and seances. When I think it was the first time I met my agent in New York when I was flying back home to the West Coast. I was reading The Little Stranger, and I was so tired. I hallucinated that I saw something floating down the aisle as I was reading this book. It freaked me out. And so that's when I thought, oh my gosh, got to close the book. But that's when you know a book is good, is when it's like manifesting in your dreams or in your life. So just want to say, I don't know, I haven't really heard anyone else who's been a big fan of that book. So I was very excited when you mentioned that.
Great. Thank you, Kat. Okay, so we have a couple of questions from the viewers, and this was kind of just a general question. It doesn't specify horror authors. They just want to know who are some of your favorite authors in general. Anyone?
Victor LaValle for horror and T. Kingfisher are both like amazing contemporary, putting stuff out right now. Stephen Graham Jones as well, if you like a slasher. He really does the trick. And then just like generally speaking, Donna Tartt, like she's only published 3 books, but every time she has published a book, it is my favorite book. The Secret History being my absolute favorite. The opening to Squad is actually a reference to The Secret History. And then sorry, I was like, I completely lost them. I will come back to me. Sorry.
Okay. Anybody else? Favorite author?
For some reason, I'm never prepared for this question, and I always go blank. But off the top of my head, I mentioned Junji Ito. When it comes to horror comics, he's like the one to beat. Mariko Tamaki does not do horror, but I love her work. For like fiction, Haruki Murakami is one of my favorites. That's what's coming to mind at the moment. So yeah.
All good.
Yeah. I'm also never prepared for this question, but for horror, echoing Maggie's, Stephen Graham Jones is one of my favorite horror writers currently writing. Hilary Mantel, I love everything that she ever published. Wolf Hall had such a has informed so much of my writing and my storytelling. And Fonda Lee, I love everything she publishes, from YA through her epic fantasy trilogy. And I'm literally staring at my bookshelf right now, trying to come up with names. And then I have to say, for better or for worse, J.R.R. Tolkien, both for the stuff that he does that I love and the stuff that he does that I hate and that I have been trying to like critique through my own work constantly.
Sure. Yeah,
I'm drawing a blank too, but I guess I have to say Edgar Allan Poe, which seems like an obvious choice for a horror fan, but I did write a novel about Edgar Allan Poe as a teenager, The Raven's Tale. So I really dove into Edgar Allan Poe and his work, his short stories and his poetry and his life, his diaries. So and Sarah Waters, like I was just mentioning, that's one of my go-to writers. If she has something new out, I'm usually all over that. Diane Setterfeld, who wrote The 13th Tale. I really drawn to her work, her prose. Those are adult, I'm mentioning all adult authors right now, but and oh gosh, there's a lot of YA horror out there. Daniel Kraus, who is involved with the summer scares, I recommend his works. Yeah, I'm trying to blank, but there are so many inspiring, amazing twists on horror, and I love that horror is not, as what Maggie was also saying, not just white cis heterosexual male gaze horror anymore. And oh, I wanted to really quickly also say that sometimes my books, I've had family members and friends say, "Are you really writing horror?" Which is so interesting to me, and I don't know if it's because we're so used to male gaze horror that, I mean, I have gore, I have ghosts. It's like, what more do you want from me to call it horror? So I just wanted to throw that out there, that I think sometimes when we're redefining what horror is, people don't even want to necessarily say, oh, that doesn't seem to fit into the box that I think of as being horror. That could be probably a whole panel topic on itself.
No, that's a great point. And I can say, like, from a library perspective, it's difficult to, which is part of what Summer Scares is for, to promote horror, because sometimes patrons just hear the genre horror and they're immediately like, no, I don't like that.
Yeah.
It's like, but it's so many things.
Right.
And if you like thrillers and you like mysteries, and there's a chance that, so it's a common hill that we're all trying to climb. So thank you for sharing that.
Sorry,
Yeah,
one
yeah.
more person. Tilly Walden is incredible. And she also did Clementine, I think like last year, which is her own Walking Dead story. And it's like incredible. Everything she does is perfect and incredible, but it was really fun to see her do the zombie apocalypse.
All right, so we have less than 10 minutes left. So we have another audience question that I think is going to dovetail kind of with my final question. And so the question from a viewer is, have any of you created a character based on yourself as a young adult?
You might notice looking at Squad that the main character kind of looks like me. Yeah, I have. Highly recommend it. You get paid for it instead of paying for therapy. It's great.
Smart.
I have not yet, actually. But it's going to happen eventually. I just feel like it's inevitable. I don't know if I'm saving it for like my first, like, I'm going to write my own graphic novel and then also draw it. Haven't done that yet. So maybe, I don't know, maybe I'll do an autobio at some point, or I don't know. It's definitely not out of the realm of possibility, but it hasn't happened yet for me.
Oh yes. And I always hesitate to say it because it's the novel that I am currently revising with my agent in preparation to go on submission. The main teenage character is just 100% me. And I always hesitate to say that because everyone's like, oh, because self-inserts get such a bad rap, but she's me. And oh yes, go.
I was just gonna say, you should never feel bad about that again, because someone recently pointed out to me that Jane Austen, who published anonymously when she was alive, named like 3 different characters Jane, and they are all hot and perfect and have the moral high ground. So like, Jane Austen did it, you can do it too.
Yeah,
that's a very, very good point. Yeah, and well, but it also is a very interesting substitute for therapy, because in the last draft, my agent was like, this character, because I never told my agent that it was a self-insert until this recent revision, and she was like, like, I think that this character could use a little bit of work, like and I realized that I was only putting in my teenage self's negative traits and like not any of the positive traits. And I was like, probably should be unpacking this in therapy. Oh, well, I'm just going to put it in the revisions. And she's a lot cooler now. So.
Thank you, Suzanne. How about you, Kat?
I feel like all my characters have pieces of me in them. Throughout all my novels, I could probably point out, oh, this is what I feel is like me. For In the Shadow of Blackbirds, my main character's name is Mary Shelley Black, named after the novelist Mary Shelley. And certainly there's some of me in there. There's sometimes I wish I were a little more like Mary Shelley Black. She's a lot more outspoken than I've been, at least verbally. I feel like I'm most outspoken in the written word. And she's really good at fixing things. And I kind of envy that about her. Like when I was writing it, one time my vacuum cleaner broke and I was taking it apart, thinking it was kind of like, what would Mary Shelley Black do sort of moment. But yes, I would say that throughout all my books, there's little bits of me. I don't know if there's one that stands out, and maybe people who know me might be able to answer better, stands out as being the most like me. And I've also, since, like I said, this takes place during the 1918 flu, I feel myself becoming like some of the adult characters in the book. Like, oh, I've become so much like her dad and her aunt, like I'm a combination of them. And so that's been interesting to see as I get older, how am I becoming like the adults that are in the background causing problems for my main characters.
Well, thank you. Okay, so like I said, that kind of dovetails into my final question. I would just like to get all of your thoughts about the importance of and the effect of writing horror and making horror accessible to specifically to a teen/YA audience. Why do you think it's important that they have access to specifically to this genre and see perhaps themselves represented in this genre? Who wants to start? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll jump in. I have just always felt that horror is a way to show readers how other people get through really horrendous, difficult situations. And it's because I wrote this book about a pandemic before we were hit by a pandemic. One thing that kind of boggled my mind is a lot of people told me, oh, I'm rereading In the Shadow of Blackbirds to help me out during this current pandemic, or I'm reading it for the first time. And I thought, why are you reading a book about a pandemic in a pandemic? That was not my go-to type of reading I wanted to do. And they said, because we see somebody coming through to the other side, we see somebody surviving. And I went, oh, okay. So it's interesting that that had to be explained to me as well. And I've always been a person with a lot of anxiety. I have an anxiety disorder, and I think it really does help me as a reader to think, okay, this person's just being pummeled with all these horrifying, scary, traumatic things, but how are they getting through it? What are they doing? And I think that's really helpful for kids. I think that's why it appealed to me as a kid, because it's scary to be a kid. It's often horrifying to be a kid, and in our current time period, it's really horrifying for so many people. And I think horror is just a way to also feel like you're not alone in feeling scared.
All right. We have about a minute left. Does anybody have anything they want to add?
Sure. I would say horror and humor share a lot of the same structure. Like, you tell a joke the same way you build a scare in a lot of ways. And both of them provide like a really profound catharsis. And what I particularly like for kids and for teenagers is often we shelter our children and our teens and we tell them everything's okay, and they are smart enough to know that we are lying. And horror is one of the ways that we can kind of look them in the eye and be like, yeah, the world is scary. Let's experiment with it in kind of a fun way. Like, it takes some of the genuine terror of life and makes it into something playful and imaginative instead. And even though you still get that like heart-thumping real fear, you know that you are physically safe while it is happening. And that is a unique experience in life when the rest of the world can be genuinely full of peril. And so, you know, in the case of Squad, which is so much about rape culture, I wanted to be able to look kids in the eye and say like, yeah, this sucks. And you shouldn't have to deal with this kind of thing. And it is not fair. And it would be fair to be this mad in reaction to it. And it's not telling them to literally go out and murder people, but it's a moment of catharsis where we can all just acknowledge what we all know is true without sort of the niceties that are required in some, like, I feel like sometimes other genres have more requirements for like sort of a moral center of niceness, and horror can do away with that in a way that can make people, like Kat said, feel less alone.
Thank you, Maggie. All right, well, we are at 2 o'clock on the dot. Thank you all for a wonderful conversation, and thank you to everybody who has been watching and participating in the Q&A. That is appreciated too. Tomorrow, all our attendees will receive an email containing the archive of this presentation, as well as some supplemental materials. And don't forget to sign up for the Summer Scares Adult Panel, which will be on June 9th, hosted by the fantastic Yika Sabat, also from the HWA. It's going to be a good one. Again, thank you so much to the panelists today for being here, and for, as I said before, creating your beautiful work and unleashing it onto the world so that we all can enjoy it. It's been a worthy addition to our Summer Scares lineup. So yeah, take care, and we will see you around.